little bit unorthodox because usually I have my compatriot in the lower half or upper half of the screen, but today it is just me. I actually wanted to pass along a message from Kelly as she was unable to make it today. But she said that she is really sorry that she couldn't be here and she wanted to make sure that everyone knew that this is important to her, but that she is recovering from a procedure. So she's doing great for like all things considered, but she is recovering today. And so here I am flying solo and wanted to answer some questions that anyone watching might have about living with OCD. So if you have any questions, please feel free to include them in the chat. I did have some questions from a backlog of questions. So I'll start with those, but would love to also prioritize any sort of questions that our live listeners have. And you can actually use the Q&A function in, I believe, in Instagram or on YouTube. So in any case, like I said, glad to be here. Thanks for being here. Kelly wishes she were here and will be back with me the next time we meet, which is in 2 weeks' time. And if you have any questions, just throw those in the comments. So with that said, I did have some really good questions from a backlog of questions. So I wanted to maybe start with those. And I just want to remind everyone that I can't give direct advice. So some of these questions talk about, particular questions related to somebody's experience. And I'll do my best to speak in generalities, but nothing that we talk about on here is ever to be used as a replacement for therapy. It's not therapy. And unfortunately, we don't have enough context to thoughtfully offer detailed support to every individual. So really important to seek out care as well. But I liked, so this question first, someone says, I've always had a really strong moral compass, and lately I find myself obsessing over whether I've done something wrong, even over tiny things. It feels like I need to confess or apologize constantly just to feel okay. How can I tell if this is my values or if this is my values or OCD talking? And it's a question that I think comes up a lot for people with moral scrupulosity, which is what this person is sort of speaking to, the intense sense of fear related to whether or not something that someone's done is morally upright or upstanding. It can be really scary for someone with OCD, the idea that maybe they've done something wrong or said something wrong. We often see this overlapping with things like social anxiety as well. Like, what if I said something that was offensive to somebody? And this can kind of go on in extremes. Like on one extreme, somebody might have thoughts like, what if I blurted something out that was inappropriate? What if I don't remember that I blurted something out that was inappropriate? Can also just be, oh my gosh, I said that. Did I phrase that the right way? Was that offensive to that person? Did they take offense to that? Are they upset with me? Again, that's where social anxiety might come into the picture. And, when this comes up, I think that I just want to reread the question real quick. To confess or apologize constantly, that drive, I think, to seek reassurance by confessing. So it's kind of an indirect way of seeking reassurance, can be really powerful. And the work that we do, Kelly and I, and the community. In fact, I just saw Kevin Foss pop on. So, hey, Kev, another awesome therapist and Fearcast podcast. But he's the host of the Fearcast podcast. Anyway, so I think that desire to confess can be really compelling, like I said. And I think also Understanding that the work that we do is exposure and response prevention. We both use a lot of mindfulness in our practice as well, is that the work is learning how to feel those feelings instead of doing an about face and running in the other direction. And again, really hard, and maybe even starting with some very, very small triggers. So if you look at in daily life, where those of us with OCD are constantly facing triggers, and the idea is to not respond by trying to eliminate whatever distress has come up, and to practice being with those feelings so that they stop running our lives. But starting with really gradual steps, and this is one of the benefits of exposure and response prevention therapy, is you can start with really small increments. So perhaps if there's a very small white lie, that like you're in Starbucks, for instance, and then you were to say, "Oh, I'm currently in a Pete's Coffee," for instance, that perhaps that would cause like a level 4 of discomfort or distress. We use something called the subjective units of distress scale. And essentially, we would do that on purpose. So maybe like phone somebody from Starbucks and then just say, "Yeah, I'm at Pete's." And then notice the anxiety that arises as a result of that, and make space for it, allow for it to be present instead of like pushing against it, because that is generally what we do. And some of the ways that we push against it, we might find ourselves, well, as the person in the question said, they might want to confess, and so refraining from confessing. "Oh, I actually I'm at Starbucks. Just kidding. I didn't mean to be dishonest." In any case, the idea is to trigger yourself on purpose, to practice being with the feelings of discomfort, which the good news is that all feelings come and go with time. That's the very nature of feelings. And so practicing being with them, allowing them for them to be there, allows you the opportunity to continue on in this example with the conversation that you were having with whoever you're on the phone with. You don't now have to derail your conversation to apologize for being dishonest about something that's really pretty innocuous, right? There's very little negative outcome associated with not being 100% transparent. I know I'm spending a lot of time on this question. There's a lot to unpack here, but I think one other thing that I will say is that people tend to think that transparency and honesty are one and the same. And they're not. Being 100% transparent is not necessary in order to be honest. And so that's something that I see people with moral scrupulosity who want to confess to people struggling with a lot. It's like, but I'm not being 100% completely honest. And full transparency, this is something that I struggled with way back in the day, in the context of recovery from alcoholism, right? I found myself really wanting to be perfect in my recovery. And that involved being like completely honest with people and about my intentions, and led to a lot of confession, as well as a lot of time spent trying to determine what my intention was, like a lot of ruminating about it. And so just understanding that there is some nuance there. It's not black and white. So for those of you who may have joined after I started this, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section. Like I said, have a backlog. So maybe I was going to take a couple, but I think I'll try this one. And if somebody in the chat is interested in asking a question, I'd love to, like I said, prioritize some of the live questions that might be coming up. But okay. So this next one is, I've been doing ERP for a while, but some days I just can't bring myself to face exposures. I end up feeling like I've failed. How do you deal with that guilt and stay consistent without burning out? Oh, this is, I think, something that a lot of people in recovery really struggle with, and it can feel very disappointing. People experience it as deflating when they're doing exposure work and then they're like, "Ah, I'm not willing to do that today." And then at the end of the day, it's like, "Oh, man, I really I was hoping I would do that. Now I'm feeling disappointment and guilt." And I think actually in some ways we can view that as functional guilt. Not meaning that people should endlessly beat up on themselves about not having done exposures. And actually, this harkens back in many ways to what I was saying with the last question, which is that it's not black and white. So if you find yourself struggling to do an exposure on a certain day, can you do a lower level exposure? Can you do a couple of lower level exposures, right? Like I think sometimes part of the reason that we don't do an exposure is because the intensity of that particular one is beyond what we're willing to tolerate in any given day. But there are other things that can be done, or even practicing tolerating other kinds of discomfort. I was just talking with Joanna Hardist, who, if you're not following her, she's fabulous. Go follow her. Um, in a class we're teaching about practicing tolerating distress of other sorts by, say, being in line at a grocery store and not picking up your phone, right? Like oftentimes when we're out and about doing errands and there's a moment that the tendency is just to immediately go for the phone, and even though that may have absolutely nothing to do with the exposures that you're working on in terms of the content, that practice of tolerating discomfort is the same. It's universal, and so maybe you practice that instead of doing the exposure that you're perceiving to be too challenging in the moment, or that you're not willing to do, I think is a more accurate way of saying it. But like I said, I think without devolving into like beating up on yourself for having done something that you're not thrilled with, um, I think that this is an opportunity to learn. If we feel guilt or disappointment or sadness after not having done exposure work, what does that tell us? Maybe that tells us that we would be better off prioritizing that, and that we would feel better in some ways if we did the exposure work, which may sound kind of strange because, of course, facing triggers is really scary. But I think that one of the beautiful things about ERP is we learn to develop a sense of pride in ourselves as we are willing to face these really difficult things. And so I think, again, taking things incrementally is really important in this process, um, and looking for other opportunities that to tolerate discomfort potentially, that aren't related directly to OCD can be useful in these moments where things are more challenging. Um, and yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Um, and let's see, and I'll take one more question, and then I'm gonna have to end for today. But like I said, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time, and I'll have my counterpart here with me. So it says, I've been doing ERP for a while, but some days, oh, wait, that's the last one I just, hello. The last question. I get stuck trying to figure out if my thoughts are OCD or if they reveal something true about me. It feels irresponsible to just let it go. How do you actually practice accepting uncertainty in those moments? And it's a really great question. Comes up all the time for folks. I think it's one of the foremost reasons that I see people resisting doing exposure work. Is like, but if I do that, what does that mean about me? Um, it might be irresponsible. Maybe I'm doing something wrong by not doing whatever compulsion I might be inclined to do. So if you take somebody with concerns about contamination related to harming others. And you consider that they might think that touching something and then refraining from washing their hands might put people around them at risk. They might have thoughts like, "Oh my gosh, I'm being irresponsible by not washing my hands. What if my concerns aren't just obsessions? Maybe there's something to this." And the question I appreciate is like, how do I accept uncertainty in these moments? Because ultimately, we can't know for sure whether or not something does pose a risk. What we do is we make our best educated guess based on the facts of the situation. And so if you've already determined that touching a particular surface seems like a reasonable choice, and that refraining from washing seems reasonable even though it's really scary, that that you the acceptance of uncertainty is really in making that choice, moving onward and saying, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just going to take this one step at a time. And I've agreed to touch this thing and refrain from washing my hands. And again, like I was saying at the outset with that first question, I think a lot of the work is just in making space for those feelings of discomfort and distress, which it's so hard and so brave ultimately. Um, the people that I work with and the people I know with OCD are some of the most caring, kind, compassionate people that I know. And the idea of being irresponsible or, you know, failing to do something and causing someone else harm can be so, so very distressing. But the reality is there's so much uncertainty that we're constantly living with, and we can't possibly eradicate or address every possible area of uncertainty. And when we try to with one particular thing, we end up foregoing things that are very important to us, right? Like we end up maybe instead, like if we're, spending time washing excessively, for instance, we might miss out on time spent with a loved one that um, could be harmful in other ways, right? So there's no perfect solution in all of this, and that's what I think the disorder really hinges on, is that there's some perfect solution, that you need to know it, that you need to follow the plan, and that's going to make sure that everything's okay. But sadly, that's just not possible. So in any case, I really appreciate you guys joining today. We will be back in a couple of weeks. Both Kelly and I will be talking about sensory motor OCD again. We'll be talking specifically about compulsions related to sensory motor OCD. And then the next time we meet, we'll be talking about exposure and response prevention. And I'm excited to also share that we'll be joined for a bonus 4th episode on sensory motor OCD with Molly Schiffer, who is at Shepherd Pratt and who just wrote a wonderful book that I had the pleasure of reading, called The Body-Based Obsessions Workbook, that goes over a number of different ways that obsessions can occur in the body, like in the context of body-related triggers. And yeah, so we're really excited to have her on, because one of the ways that does come up is with sensory motor related obsessions. So with all of that said, I hope you guys have a great couple of weeks. Thanks for being here, and look forward to seeing you all soon.